The president fired the Homeland Security Secretary yesterday. Then today he fired the head of the U.S. Secret Service. There are also now reports that he's about to fire a number of other Department of Homeland Security officials, including the number 3 official at the agency. He apparently needs her out next so he can install his preferred replacement for Kirstjen Nielsen as acting secretary of the whole department. If he goes through that process of firing the number 3 official to make room for the acting guy who he wants to put in place, that of course will mean that Trump will need another acting official to take over that guy's current job, which is running the Customs and Border Protection Agency. I mean, just at Homeland Security alone, that means we will have an acting secretary, we'll have no deputy secretary. The number 2 official in the agency left a year ago and never got replaced. The next person down the chain of command is the number 3 official in the department. That's the person who is reportedly about to be fired as well. There's also an acting head of FEMA. There's now a new acting head of ICE. There's an acting inspector general at the department. We're soon to have an acting head of Customs and Border Protection once he becomes the acting secretary. We also are about, I guess, to have a new acting head of the Secret Service. I mean, when the new acting Secretary of Homeland Security starts going to cabinet meetings and starts appearing at White House events and starts having to answer for the actions of his agency, he will be in good company in this administration. Right? There's also an acting Defense Secretary and an acting Interior Secretary, an acting head of the Food and Drug Administration, an acting head of the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration. Not like we need a good one of those right now or anything. There's also the acting head of the Small Business Administration, the acting head of the Office of Management and Budget. There's even an acting White House Chief of Staff, which doesn't even make sense. But that's what they call Mick Mulvaney now. They call him acting White House Chief of Staff, as if he hasn't yet been nominated for this Senate-confirmed position. White House Chief of Staff is not a Senate-confirmed position. They're just calling him an acting to keep him on his toes. I think that there's a couple of different things going on here. Part of it, I think, is just turnover. I mean, this president is barely through half of one term in office. He has already chewed up and spat out cabinet secretaries from almost every cabinet level agency that serves under him, from Health and Human Services. Remember Tom Price? Remember him? The State Department, the Defense Department, the Department of Justice, Attorney General, the Interior Department, the VA, the EPA, now Homeland Security. He's turfed out all of those cabinet secretaries. He's on his 3rd White House Chief of Staff already, even if the current one is just acting. He's gone through 5 White House communications directors. I don't think he even has a new one, acting or not. For the first, year and a half of the Trump administration, the rate of turnover, the rate of people being fired or quitting or leaving in scandal and disgrace or under threat of indictment was so overwhelming that we used to try to keep track of all the departures in one big graphic here in the studio. It sort of just became too much in the end and we stopped doing it. There are not enough pixels in the world to make it worth it after a certain point. But what we didn't see coming, what I didn't see coming, about that incredible pace of turnover, about that rapid pace of people departing from the Trump administration, people being fired or leaving in disgrace or fleeing on their own terms. What I didn't see at the time about how fast the Trump administration was emptying out so early on was that in so many of these cases where people left under whatever circumstances, they wouldn't ultimately get replaced. That's turned out to be really important. And over time, I think the Trump administration and the president particularly have decided that that dynamic is not a problem. That's not like falling down on the job. Maybe this is part of the way they're deliberately trying to run the government under President Bush now. Excuse me, President Trump now. Jonathan Blitzer, reporter at The New Yorker today, says that as long as a year ago, last spring, a senior Homeland Security Department official told him that Kirstjen Nielsen couldn't be fired even back then, despite reported conflict between her and the White House. She couldn't be fired a year ago because this DHS official insisted there was no number 2 official at that agency. There was no deputy secretary in place, so there wouldn't be anybody to step up and run the department if Kirstjen Nielsen got canned. That was the argument a year ago for why she couldn't possibly be fired. That would be disastrous for the agency. You couldn't do that to an agency that big. You realize how big Homeland Security is? Fast forward a year later to today, there is still nobody in that number 2 job at Homeland Security. They never even bothered nominating anybody for the number 2 job at that agency when the last deputy secretary quit last April. But now, nevertheless, Kirstjen Nielsen is out anyway. There still isn't anybody in the number 2 job. That was supposedly enough to constrain them from firing her a year ago. But now that's no constraint. And in addition to her being fired, while there's no number 2 agent, no number 2 official at the agency, now everybody is waiting on the number 3 person at the agency to get fired as well. And what, you think they're going to be replaced? I mean, in a normal administration, you'd expect people at that high a level of that big an agency to be replaced, and on the double. I mean, if nothing else, you'd usually think that if you tried to declare something a national emergency, that would mean you'd want to staff up the parts of the federal government that are assigned to deal with that supposed emergency. It's quite the opposite here. The president is simultaneously declaring a national emergency on the border, and he's firing all officials for all major agencies that deal with that in the federal government without any real effort to nominate replacements for them. And it doesn't seem to be because he just wants to install his own acolytes and devotees who might more closely match his policy aims in these jobs. I mean, there are multiple reports tonight that the guy he's putting in as the acting Homeland Security Secretary after Kirstjen Nielsen is somebody the president doesn't even know. It's not somebody who he's been, waiting forever to see where he can get this great guy into a high-level job. This culling people out of top-level jobs in the government, this culling of the cabinet and agency heads and top agency officials, it doesn't appear to be just the product of laziness or not understanding that appointing people to high-level jobs is part of the job of running the executive branch. If it were just that, I think we wouldn't see it accelerating over time as part of the way Trump is doing business in this White House. I mean, I think part of what's going on here is as he leaves the upper echelons of these agencies vacant, as he fires cabinet secretaries and refuses to nominate anybody to replace them, he leaves instead these comparatively weak, low-profile acting officials who, of course, don't have to go through the Senate confirmation process. These are officials who answer only to the president and the president alone in terms of how they got their job and how long they have it. Because they're all brought in for indefinite terms with no promise of any longevity in the job beyond the president's whim, they also don't bring in their own senior staff to run the agency they think this agency should be run. The Washington Post editorialized on this afternoon. Quote, acting chiefs often don't have the chance to install a team, though no leader of a major department can succeed without one. It makes recruitment harder, too. Who wants to work for a boss who may be gone soon? Quote, under Mr. Trump, who values personal loyalty over capability or principle, acting appointees have every reason to cater to his whims and forsake the naughtier problems that won't earn brownie points in the White House. Quote, by appointing so many acting chiefs, Mr. Trump undercuts the Senate's job of giving advice and consent on major appointments. Overall, the practice injects uncertainty and disruptiveness. And that sort of sounds perfect, right, for this administration on so many different levels. It's uncertainty. It's disruptive. I mean, having acting cabinet officials at all your agencies, just emptying out the ranks of senior officials at all these agencies, it does have the direct benefit of dodging the whole Senate confirmation process, which is nice, I'm sure, even in a friendly and compliant Senate, right? You don't want to bother to have your employees that you think of as employees and your appointees, right? You don't want to bother to have them vetted by any outside entity. Also, some people sometimes say things in confirmation hearings that the Congress tends to hold them to once they're in place running that agency. You wouldn't want that. Keeping these acting officials there and making sure there's no senior executives around them, it limits the ability of these agencies to get anything done through the normal ways that agencies usually get things done. But the benefit of it for a president like this is that it just bluntly changes the profile of power in the American federal government, right? If you don't have any Senate-confirmed cabinet secretaries, if you don't have any strong, recognizable leaders effectively running major federal agencies in the executive branch, then you don't run the risk of there being even a single minor counterweight against the president's power anywhere inside the executive branch. The smaller he can make every other supposedly major player, the larger he becomes, both in the public's eye in terms of how the federal government is perceived, but also in terms of how policy is made, how stuff gets done, and who says. If you fill the whole executive branch of government, including the cabinet, with essentially temps, well, the balance of power in the Trump administration is stark as it can possibly be. I mean, you're either Trump, right? I mean, you're Jared or Ivanka or you're President Trump himself, or you just work there. I mean, there's two categories, right? Family or the hired help. And for the hired help, they're not only replaceable, they are unmemorable. They get replaced at a moment's notice on a whim, and everybody serving in any job that's not a family job knows it. Right? You better behave like you're infinitely replaceable, or some new Kelly girl will be here to take your place in the morning. This consolidation of power in the president and only in the president is sort of a new style of federal governance for the United States of America. There is a word for it in political science. It starts with A. But I think what we're seeing right now, specifically with this purge of Homeland Security officials, one which we appear to be in the middle of. I mean, we've seen the secretary of the agency and also all these other subsidiary agency heads lose their jobs already. It is expected that more of them are going to lose their jobs in days to come. With what's going on at Homeland Security in particular, I think there may be one other related dynamic at work. And it runs right alongside this overall effort to avoid oversight, to avoid anybody wielding any sort of power in any visible way who's not named President Donald Trump. And I think the other dynamic that we're seeing, particularly with this Homeland Security stuff, is the question about whether the president is constrained, if not by Congress, and if not by the balance of power within the legislative and executive branches. There's the additional question of whether or not the president is constrained by law. And that's coming up quite bluntly in this Homeland Security stuff that's happening right now. CNN had a striking story today about the president's trip to Calexico last week. Calexico, a California town right on the Mexico border. This is CNN's reporting, quote, last Friday, the president visited Calexico, California, where he said, we're full. Our system's full. Our country's full. Can't come in. Our country's full. What can you do? We can't handle anymore. Our country's full. Can't come in. I'm sorry. It's very simple. Two sources told CNN that behind the scenes, the president told border agents at this event to not let migrants in. He said, tell them we don't have the capacity. If judges give you trouble, say, sorry, judge, I can't do it. We don't have the room. According to CNN, after the president left the room where he had made those remarks, those border agents he had been speaking to sought further advice from their leaders in their agency. Their leaders told the agents they were not giving them that direction, and if they did what the president said, they would take on personal liability. The agents were told, you have to follow the law. You have to follow the law, not what the president told you to do, which would be violating the law. And this, of course, isn't the first time the president appears to be ignorant of the law or interested in flouting it directly. But he does seem to have a real fervor for flouting the law and for being publicly seen to defy the law when it comes to the border and to immigrants. I mean, this is from the New York Times story yesterday with the initial reports that Kirstjen Nielsen was being fired at Homeland Security. Quote, the president called Ms. Nielsen at home early in the mornings to demand that she take action to stop migrants from entering the country, including doing things that were clearly illegal, such as blocking all migrants from seeking asylum. She repeatedly noted the limitations imposed on her department by federal laws, court settlements, and international obligations. Quote, those responses only infuriated Mr. Trump further. After that report from the Times, NBC News was first to report today that the president has been insisting on reinstating large-scale separation of migrant families crossing the border, meaning taking kids away from their parents. He wants that reinstated on a large scale, despite his own executive order halting that policy last year, and despite now multiple court orders that forbid him from reinstating it. Again, according to multiple sources, NBC is reporting that Kirstjen Nielsen told President Trump that he was not legally allowed to reinstate the policy. Legally, he can't do it. Federal court orders prohibit her agency from reinstating that policy. The president has nevertheless been demanding that she do it. After that report from NBC News, that was matched today by the Wall Street Journal and other sources. Here's again how CNN reported it today. Quote, senior administration officials tell CNN that within the last 4 months or so, the president had been pushing Nielsen to enforce a stricter and more widespread zero-tolerance immigration policy. According to multiple sources, the president wanted families separated even if they came in at a legal port of entry and were legal asylum seekers. Quote, the president wanted families separated even if they were apprehended within the United States. Sources told CNN that Nielsen tried to explain they couldn't bring the policy back because of court challenges, White House staffers tried to explain to the president it would be an unmitigated PR disaster. But the president wants it anyway. A senior administration official now telling CNN, quote, he just wants to separate families. He just wants to do it. He likes it. He likes the way this looks. He thinks it's an excellent idea for what he should do with his powers as president. And anybody telling him no has to go. And so the Department of Homeland Security must be sheared of all its top leadership. That said, there's nothing to indicate that these leaders at the Department of Homeland Security who are all getting fired now, nothing to indicate that they themselves were against taking little kids away from their families. Nothing to suggest that they, as individual leaders, were standing in the way of the president taking kids away from their families or breaking any of these other laws the president insists that they break. Now, the reason the president has been getting told no by these Homeland Security officials is because these policies he wants to pursue aren't within the legal abilities of the agency. He wants to do stuff that courts say is illegal. He's therefore constrained from doing any of this stuff. I mean, if all these folks at Homeland Security are now losing their jobs because the president wants more babies taken away from their parents, it's not because anybody in this administration is going to go down in history as a moral hero for standing up to him on that issue. It's because he's legally constrained from even trying to do that. At least he's supposed to be. And that is an active fight right now, and we're going to check in on the status of that next. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.